Good morning. So I get to start Preacher's Choice. It's a little scary when you're just given like a complete open, like you can choose anything. And so definitely a few weeks ago, I had like decision paralysis. Like, oh my goodness, what am I going to talk about? Like I could talk about anything. And so I feel like I do better if Eric's like, this is what you're going to talk about, and then I can start researching. But I have been in the middle, a long journey of kind of studying through the Bible Project's different classes, and they actually have, at this point, I think 4 or 5 classes just on the book of Genesis, going through all of the major characters of the Bible. And so I've been kind of in the middle of like, I think 40 hours on Jacob, and so I was like, I guess that's what I'm going to choose today. So I'm hoping to be able to share just a tiny bit of what I've been learning through that. And so would you pray with me to start? God, thank you so much for this morning. Thank you so much. Just I think of last week and talking about our gifts and that we're one body in the church. And I just thank you for Angel's story and for the way that you spoke to him and showed him that he had a gift that he might have not even realized that he had, God. And so I just pray for more of that for all of us to realize our gifts, for those of us who do know our gifts, to help other people to find their own, God. And I just thank you for Angel's step of faith to say, I'm going to continue this on and to go help Eugenia. And so I just am so thankful for that story. And so I just pray over this morning just for us to learn from the many characters that we're going to end up talking about today. Just give me the words to speak. And I pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. So I love this graphic that we're using today. Unfortunately, I'm using a lot of pictures, so I have slightly different, we'll come to that in a second, but slightly different backgrounds in some of mine. But I love this. I guess, thinking of A Choice of a Rose. I've never watched the show that goes along with it, but I guess that has to do with Preacher's Choice. So, but have you ever noticed, and this kind of gives it away, the picture that I showed up for a minute, how familiar songs can be like a powerful cue, helping to like take us back, to past events, people, or places. For those millennials in the room, that's like a 90s playlist, takes you back to high school. Some of you guys will experience that. Maybe, what is it? The 2025 top song is gonna like take you back to high school. That's weird to think about, but if anyone's a musical theater person like me, I was in musicals, I was in like the pit orchestra my freshman year, you might be familiar with the overture. So if you've ever been to a musical before, and operas as well, but it serves multiple purposes. It does tell you, like, everybody sit down, it's about to start, but that's not really the purpose. It usually actually kind of introduces the melodies that you're gonna hear, so it kind of does like a little piece of each song that you're gonna hear. And it gives you kind of an insight to what's coming later in the story. Now, this is also true in movies. Actually, older movies kind of used to have overtures in a way that don't as much anymore. But just in a movie in general, music often tells us like what we're supposed to feel or gives us an insight into what's coming. And if you were to watch a movie that didn't have music, it would kind of be like a jarring experience, right? But it would feel like it was missing something. So I have a few examples of music that we are almost all familiar with in our culture. So I kind of have pictures to go along, but here's our first one. There's a little giveaway in that. Right? So when we're listening to this, we all know what to expect, right? Unless you've been hiding under a rock or something like that. The next one, we can go to the next one, right? This is actually the actual music of it, so same movie, different feeling though, right? Who's coming in this one? Star Wars nerds in the room. Is it good guys or bad guys, I guess? This is the March of the Resistance, so it should actually be the good guys, but you probably have to get further into the song. But anyway, that's good enough. Thank you, Peter. But like, we know what we're supposed to be feeling, right? I looked up, actually, I was trying to think, like, okay, what music would be that? And there's, like, the song, like, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, like that song that, is like, everything's okay, in music or things like that. But it all is kind of, the director is trying to remind us of what we're supposed to feel or who's about to enter the frame, right? Well, the biblical authors use these same design patterns to help us follow themes, that run throughout the Old Testament narratives, but also just the Bible as a whole. And this is the stuff that gets me very excited. So I hope that I can present this and make you just as excited today. But today we're going to focus on the narrative of the life of Jacob, and we'll talk more about him if it's not somebody you're familiar with. But the story of Jacob and his sons, one of them is Joseph, musical about that, but it takes up about half of the book of Genesis, like the entire second half. But interestingly, Jacob, we don't really talk about him as much, as his grandfather Abraham. But as you study the life of Jacob, it's very clear that he is a complicated historical figure, right? The melodies that we see and that we'll see played in his life are mostly not pleasant ones. But in order to understand the story of Jacob's life and the themes that are present, we actually have to go all the way back to the overture, where we first were introduced to the melody. So we're going to actually start all the way back in the Garden of Eden. We'll get to there. So I'll go back to what I had written in there before. But there are a few main themes. We'll get into a couple more. But basically, I'm going to attempt to tell the story of Genesis this morning. And if you don't know, it's like 50 chapters. So we're not going to go all 50. But here's the overall melody of the Bible. So our first kind of, I guess it would be, I don't know, act, or if you're talking about musicals, but it would be creation and blessing. Then we have fall, folly, test or failure, going into decreation, and then recreation again. So we're not going to talk a lot about it yet, but we're going to actually observe it. We're going to look for it ourselves. So this is from the Bible Project, Genesis 1 through 9, which basically takes us from about Adam and Eve all the way through Noah, introduces us to a thematic melody moving from blessing to deception, curse, division, exile, violence, and decreation, before resolving in the rescue of a remnant to begin the cycle anew. Like I said, it goes from Adam and Eve to Noah. And in Genesis, this will get to our first picture. So you'll see a lot of these black and white pictures just kind of as a representation of what we're talking about. But in Genesis, we learn that God creates everything, right? So this is Genesis 1. And in this perfect garden that he creates, Eden, he creates humans in his image to rule with him over all creation. He blesses them, and he tells them to be fruitful and multiply and rule with him. But he tells them that there is one tree in the garden that they are not supposed to eat. We learn then, Genesis 3, that the serpent comes and tells Eve, like, are you sure God said that you can't eat for this tree, And he ultimately makes her question what God said, and kind of her and Adam question, is God holding out on us, right? Is there a blessing that he's holding back from us? So eventually they're exiled from the garden, and yet God doesn't abandon them. Adam and Eve have two sons, first Cain and then Abel, and we're told that both brothers bring an offering to God, but that God favors Abel's offering. So this first interaction between brothers, introduces the way that God doesn't work like the power structures of the world. So, to us in our current context, the idea of being the firstborn, which I'm actually the firstborn, but more specifically, the firstborn son, doesn't really hold the weight that it did during the ancient Hebrew culture, right? The firstborn son would have been the father's principal heir and receive a double portion of inheritance. So it's a big deal. The ancient Hebrew readers of the book of Genesis, hearing of two sons, would expect that the older son to receive this double blessing, right? And then respect that comes with that recognition. But immediately, we see in this interaction between Cain and Abel that his younger brother is the one who's favored by God. Now, if you read the narrative, it never says that Cain is not favored by God, right? God just notices Abel for a purpose. And this results in jealousy and anger from Cain, and eventually, Cain murders his brother, right? This is like from the jump, guys. Like, humanity in the second generation is not off to a good start. Adam and Eve have another son. I know it's like we're going through this fast. Adam and Eve have another son named Seth, and the reason this is important is because the line that continues actually goes through him. So we learn that he's like the great, whatever, 10 generations of great. He's the great grandfather of Noah. And at this point, when we get to this time, in humanity, it's full of wickedness. To the point where if you read this part of Genesis, God says he regrets creating humans. But God finds a righteous remnant, which kind of think back to that first slide. We hear of the story of decreation in the flood. It's the story of God separating the chaotic waters in Genesis 1 in reverse. But Noah and his family are saved in the ark, a type of floating Eden. And eventually, it comes to rest on the top of a mountain, and Noah builds an altar there to present an offering to God. And God is pleased with it. He again blesses Noah and his family and tells them to be fruitful and multiply, and that they're to help take care of the earth, right? Similar to the blessing for Adam and Eve. Well, everything's going well, but then Noah plants a garden, kind of echoes of his ancestors, more specifically a vineyard. And Noah gets drunk on wine. And we find out that disgraceful things happen that involve one of his sons. We don't really have time to get into that part of the story. But basically, the melody of curse returns to this story. And in between this and our next main character, the narratives of like the Tower of Babel occur. If you've not heard of that, it's basically people were trying to literally build their way to heaven and make a name for themselves. Do you see a melody already forming, right? If you listen to it from the human side, it sounds like jealousy and deceit and mistrust and pride and murder. And yet, the melody of God is one of continued blessing and faithfulness. In all the narratives that we speak about today, a narrator is never going to pop in and be like, and that was a very bad choice by fill in the blank, right? Instead, we can look at the consequences of their actions and see what results from their poor choices. So this is a reminder that a lot of us that have been up here have talked about, that biblical narratives are descriptive, not prescriptive. That means they describe the lives of these biblical characters, but the narrators are not telling us to emulate their behavior. All right, now we're finally getting to the grandfather of our subject of the day. So we meet Abram, later named Abraham. Oh, there we go. So we'll be reading this in a second. And this is in Genesis 12. So we're already 12 chapters in. And immediately we see that Abram has been chosen to receive a blessing from God, a melody that's become familiar. So it says, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you.'" Now, we could discuss a lot of Abraham's story. I actually have in a past series on women of the Bible where we talked about Hagar, who we'll talk about in a minute. But today we'll focus on the promise God made to make Abram a great nation, which implies that he'll have a lot of descendants, except his wife Sarai has not been able to have a baby. And you'll see they all get renamed in this story. But Sarai, she can't, she's not able to get pregnant, and she suggests that Abram, that he should sleep with her servant Hagar and have a child with her. Pretty soon they didn't trust that God that he would actually fulfill the promise that he had given to them, and they decide to take matters into their own hands, even though God had promised that they would have descendants, that number the stars in the sky. So Hagar does have a child named Ishmael, who is the first son, right, of Abram. And Sarai is immediately jealous and hates Hagar. And so I kind of talked about the story of Hagar last year sometime when I talked about her. You know, we will eventually learn that despite their disbelief, God keeps his promise, and Sarai now, who is renamed Sarah, has a baby, and God tells them that his name will be Isaac. I love this part. Isaac means laughter, because Sarah laughed at the promise that God made to her and that she would have a child in her old age. In the one class I took, it actually talks about the fact that if you read it in the ancient Hebrew, it says essentially like that she laughed that she would have this Eden in her old age, like meaning blessing. So it's all connected. So they're blessed with this child Isaac, and we learn in Genesis that God promises to bless Ishmael as well. So even after Sarah's jealousy leads her to actually send Hagar away, God takes care of Hagar and Ishmael. And God promises Hagar that he will make Ishmael a great nation as well. You know, even though God made a promise to Abraham to bless Isaac and make a great nation through him, there's enough blessing to go around. And we learn from God's promise that the purpose of Abraham's blessing that we just read is so that the peoples of the earth would be blessed through him. Well, we then learn that Abraham's trust in God is tested. He's asked to bring a sacrifice, and we don't have time to dig into that story, but God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Oops, sorry, I thought I had a picture of that. But God again reminds Abraham of his promise to bless Abraham and his descendants because of his obedience in this story. All right, Isaac grows up, he marries Rebekah, and now we finally get to the beginning of the story of Jacob. So this is Genesis 25. And in Genesis 25, it tells us that Rebekah, Isaac's wife, has again not been able to have a child. But in this story, Isaac prayed on her behalf, and God answers his prayer. So in this instance, it seems that maybe that he actually did learn something from his parents' mistakes. And this is what it says in Genesis 25. The Lord said to her, and this is kind of after she felt like stuff like weirdly going on inside of her, like some fighting maybe. And it said, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man in the open country, while Jacob was content to stay home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So we find out from Genesis 25 that Rebekah feels fighting going on in her womb, and God comes to tell her that they're twins, 2 peoples, and that the older will serve the younger. So we're to infer from what we know about the melody that the younger brother will be blessed. God is again inverting the power structure. And any of these stories on their own might be more confusing to us, but if we see them in the bigger picture, they make more sense. So then, in the birth story of Jacob and his brother, twins that are on their way out, this would be crazy to see. Esau's born first, but Jacob is literally like grabbing his heel trying to beat him out of Rebekah's womb. So Jacob's name, Yaakov in Hebrew, all of these names are way cooler in Hebrew, actually means heel grabber. And the idea is like if you were grabbing someone's heel, like trying to trip them. It's interpreted basically as the deceiver. And as we continue, it turns out to be a very appropriate name. So in the next set of verses, we learn, and I found some kind of drawings here. This is like Sunday school coloring pages. But in the next set of verses, we learn that Jacob is like cooking some stew. We actually learn that it doesn't have any meat in it. We could go down a rabbit hole with that. But Esau the hunter, who actually loves meat, comes in from the field, and he is like hangry, right? He's very hungry. And Jacob takes this opportunity to make a deal with him. And like this story is very short, so it's weird if you just read it on its own. But basically, he's like, all right, you want this stew? Give me your birthright. And I heard it said in one of my classes, it's basically like he pulls out this signed contract out of his pocket and is like, sign here if you want some stew. So Esau dramatically basically says well, I'm going to die of hunger anyway, so sure, why not? And one of the craziest questions kind of about this first story is that we know that God promised Jacob before birth that he was going to receive the blessing. We know that Rebekah knows that, but we don't know, and we will never know, if she told Jacob this or if she even told her husband Isaac, right? Either way, Jacob is not going to leave this up to anyone else, right? So he receives his brother's birthright in this. Well, fast forward a couple of chapters in Genesis 27, and Isaac is now an old man. We learn that his eyesight is failing him, which is an important part of the story. And he feels like he might be close to death. Spoiler alert, he's actually not. He's in many further chapters. But so he calls on his eldest son Esau and tells him to basically make him something to eat. So they're very similar. They like food. And that he will give him his blessing. But in the meantime, he's like, go out to the field, do these things. So basically, at this point, Rebekah has a kind of chance to do something about this, right? Now, in many cases, so if we think about birthright, right? Jacob kind of already took this. In many cases, the birthright that Jacob tricked Esau into giving him and the blessing would actually be one and the same. But in this narrative, for some reason, they're split into two. So when Rebekah overhears this plan, since her favor rests with her son Jacob, she makes a plan to deceive Isaac so that he will receive Esau's blessing, right? So she makes some food for Isaac and dresses Jacob up in Esau's clothes, right? So that he smells like his brother. But Jacob's like, how's this gonna work? Esau is super hairy. I can't even grow a beard. So Rebekah gets goat skin and fashions body hair onto her son Jacob so that they can trick his dad. We have to wonder, what in the world is Rebekah thinking here, right? She was told by God that her younger son would receive God's blessing. The older will serve the younger. So does she not trust God? Right? Even after he blessed her with the children that she and Isaac had hoped for and prayed for. This is what I love about biblical narrative, right? In every interaction through the generations, the ones that we've talked about already today, we can see a glimpse of ourselves, right? Instead of trusting God to do what he said he would do, Rebekah just takes the matters into her own hands. Where have we heard that melody before, right? Maybe in the garden with the snake and the apple. Maybe Abraham and Sarah, using and mistreating Hagar when they didn't trust God to bless them with the child that he had promised. Or maybe I look at myself and all the times that God has kept his promises to me for provision or protection, but then I so quickly start mistrusting him again and worrying and trying to hold tightly onto the parts of my life, thinking I can do it by myself. Do we need a narrator to tell us how it's going to go for Rebekah and Jacob? Or do we already hear the ominous music that's about to come? So Jacob is afraid that he will be cursed for tricking his father. But Rebekah's like, it's all right, I'll take the curse on myself. And for him, just to listen to her, which didn't really, work so well before. So Esau comes back and he's mad. He's really, really mad. And eventually he asks his dad, can't you bless me too? And it's really just a sentence in the just one verse, but we basically learned from the text that Isaac is weeping and pretty much is nope, that's all I got. But we know in past narratives that God has been clear that even though he chooses a person for blessing, and purpose, the point is that everybody's blessed, right? So, this is just kind of an interesting thought, is that does Isaac just have a small view of God? Did he not believe that there was enough blessing to go around? We don't know, but it's just another question we can ask ourselves. Do we limit our idea of God? Do we believe that we have to hold on to every blessing, that we've received because there's not enough to go around? Do we gatekeep God's blessing to save enough for ourselves? Well, continuing the story, Esau follows in his early ancestors' footsteps, and he decides he's going to kill his brother. So Rebekah, trying to protect him, tells Jacob that he needs to leave and go hang out with her brother Laban until Esau cools off and forgets about this betrayal of his brother. And so she and Isaac send him off, because Isaac obviously knows what happened, that it really was Jacob that he blessed. We don't find out until later in the narrative, and this is really sad when I thought about it, but this is the last time that Rebekah ever sees Jacob. So the thing that she was most afraid of, losing her son by Esau killing him, and then obviously Esau would be in trouble, it happens anyway. She never sees him again. So Jacob leaves just like Rebekah tells him, and during his travel to Laban, he stops for the night, and he has this dream where he sees a ladder reaching from earth all the way to heaven. And in this dream, God speaks to Jacob, reminding him of his blessing. And maybe this is actually the first time that he's hearing this from God himself. So this is in Genesis 28. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And obviously, Jacob is deeply affected by this vision, and he vows that God will be his God. Now soon, he reaches his destination, and we learn of another story of deceit in his family, as Jacob wants to marry one sister in this family, Rachel, but is tricked into marrying her sister, Leah, instead. Now, we'll talk more about Jacob's children in a minute, but we learn then later in the story, so we got to kind of skip a few chapters, that Esau is coming to meet Jacob. He hears about this. And Jacob is terrified. He hasn't seen his brother since he tricked him. And he is sure that Esau is coming to kill him and his family. So he plans to put together a bunch of his animals as a gift and send them and his servants up ahead to pacify Esau and be just tell him I'm on my way, behind everybody. So he sends everyone, including his 2 wives and 11 kids. This dude is a coward, right? He's willing to send even his children ahead of him for fear of his brother. So we learn, maybe that vision that he had and his vow to God, not sure how that affected him in this minute. So we learn that he actually has another vision or dream or experience where a man, so this is kind of the night before he's going to meet Esau, and he has a vision of this man that comes and wrestles him. It kind of sounds like a dream that Eric might have when he's taking Benadryl, but we basically learn that this wrestling match ends with Jacob's hip being ripped from the socket, and he's never the same in his life again. Now, Tim Mackey of the Bible Project says it this way in the class I've been taking, and in a second you'll know why I'm crediting someone else for this. Basically, he says that we learn in this story that the stranger, who Jacob will identify as God, basically kicked him so hard in the groin that his hip came out of the socket. Yes, that is what you heard. So now I know this means a lot more to half of this room than it does to the other half, but in this intense, seemingly needed kick in the literal and metaphorical pants is when God changes Jacob's name, right? So this, in Genesis 32, is when we learn that Jacob has a name change. And name changes in the Bible are a very big deal. So this is verse 27. The man asked him, we know this is actually God, "What is your name?" Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." This is a momentous occasion. Israel, the name that God gives to his chosen people, comes from Jacob, the deceiver, the heel grabber, the guy that was chosen from the beginning but had a hard time trusting God and tried to grab any blessing he could for himself. If you know the story of the Israelites, the melody might sound familiar, right? Maybe the name actually fits after all. And if you want to know how the story of Israel continues, the people, I encourage you to read the book of Exodus that comes next and look for the melody lines that we have already listened for today. Now, I hope you're wondering, okay, what happens after this wrestling match? Well, first of all, Jacob is limping, which maybe a lot of you could relate to, but he changes his plan, and instead of hiding in the back, he goes to the front to meet Esau, his brother, after all. So maybe this second interaction worked a little better. Well, it's really interesting because they meet up, and Esau sees all these women and children. He's like, who are these people? He's like, these are my wives and kids. And then Esau's like, what are all these animals? And he's like, well, these are an offering to you. And in a weird, unexpected turn of events, if you think of their earlier interactions as kids or young people, Esau's like, no, I'm good. I have everything I need. And they have this back and forth of being generous and kind to one another. So it turned out that there was enough blessing for both of them. And yet they spent years fighting over the scarcity of blessing that they thought existed. I wish we had time to go deeper into the next set of descendants, the sons of Jacob, who unfortunately haven't seemed to learn from their father's mistakes. The next narrative is about Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob, but the one who is chosen and his brothers do not like that at all, and there's a whole musical about that one. But the melodies of mistrust and deceit continue, and yet so does God's faithfulness. So why overview 33 chapters of Genesis this morning, right? Well, first of all, it is a great story. It has all the drama of the best reality TV of today, right? Secondly, the biblical writers took great care to weave these themes throughout the ancient text. It was never meant to be cherry-picked and just read individual verses. We're supposed to see the big picture, the greater narrative. So when we read weird stories that are a few verses long that are this dude gave up his birthright for stew, it was meant to make more sense in the larger narrative. And we just scratched the surface of the amount of melodies or themes that we could have followed through Genesis. There are so many. I challenge you to read through Genesis and just notice the theme of water, just the theme of water, or just the theme of the direction that everybody travels, or the theme of mountains, and I could go on. There's so many more. But especially for those of you who've never read through the Bible or maybe have seen it as, an old, boring book, I hope that today helps you to see that the Bible is a literary masterpiece, right? And I hope that you want to search for some of these things yourself. Now, furthermore, like any good narrative, the biblical narrative helps us to examine our own motives and attitudes and behaviors as we see them reflected in characters we read about. And we do this with fiction, with books of fiction that we read today. But most importantly, everything we read and talked about today points us to our need for Jesus. From the moment that Adam and Eve stepped out of the garden, God has been working to restore humans' relationships with him through his chosen people. And as I was studying these themes, one day I was walking and thinking about it, and it just hit me as a wave. I was like, wait, we're the second born. And I didn't think of that. That's, something that's been written lots about. But God was telling me that, this is how he flipped things upside down. In the New Testament, Jesus is called the firstborn over all creation, right? When we read through the Gospels, like we recently did in the series of Mark, we see Jesus act differently than these other firstborns that we see in Genesis. Jesus is also the chosen one, because sometimes those were not the same, right? Unlike many of the chosen ones, he lives a perfect life, one of humility and devotion to his Father. And instead of fighting over inheritance and blessing, he lays it all down on the cross. So thinking about us as the secondborn, Jesus freely gives up his rights as the firstborn and his blessings as the chosen one. And like many of the secondborns that we spoke of today, God gives the blessing meant for Jesus to us. This is like the masterpiece crescendo of the melody that we followed through Genesis today and through all of the Bible. If this is true, if I have the rights of the firstborn and all the blessings that come with that, why do I fall back into acting more like Jacob? When I read through Jacob's story, I want to yell. It's easy to be like, the blessing is yours, dummy. You don't have to fight for it. You were chosen. God has a plan for you and your family to bless you and bless others through you. But too often, I'm afraid, You could say the same thing to me about my story. God has a plan for you, dummy. You are chosen. He already promised to provide, and yet here you go again, spiraling into anxiety and worry like he won't this time. The story of Jacob, the story of Israel, the person and the people that are named after him, it's my story too. Life is hard, and there are times when we can feel like God is holding out on us. And our instinct can be to mistrust God like Adam and Eve, or to make our own way like Abraham and Sarah. And sometimes we want to grab and hold tightly onto blessings like Jacob and keep them for ourselves. Now there's comfort in knowing that we're not alone. Unfortunately, we're part of a melody that has been repeating since the creation of the world. But there is good news. God did not give up on Adam and Eve. He didn't give up on Noah. He didn't give up on Abraham and Sarah or Isaac or Jacob or the people of Israel. And he's not giving up on me, and he's not giving up on you. God had a plan all along to bless us, to be a blessing. And there's enough to go around, right? So my challenge is, let's go out this week living as God's chosen people, blessing others in all the places that we go, whether that's school or work or your neighborhood or the store. What if the music playing, going back to our music melody, what if the music playing when we walk into a space is that of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and humility and justice? Let's pray as we close today. God, I just thank you so much for the masterpiece that is your word and for the writers that wove this all together, God. Thank you that we can see ourselves in all of these stories, whether good or bad, but that it can help us examine our own lives. And God, thank you for Jesus, your firstborn, and the fact that he was willing to give up his rights and his blessings and give them to us, God. Thank you that we are chosen, that we are blessed, and God, we are sorry for the times where we try to hold on to that for ourselves. God, please help us this week to live as the chosen, blessed people that we are, and to use that blessing to bless others around us. Help the melodies that we bring into the places that we go be ones that bless other people. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.